Terrified, I watched him waver between praying silently and confessing in torrents. Silas continued to protest loudly that it was all a mistake, but I waited in vain for Cestus to defend himself. I knew he couldn't. Cestus was an honest man. Oh, but how had this honest man become involved in such things? Murder, treason. When I thought of the men that died because of his actions, I could only quail in fear of the gods. Why had we ever trusted Silas? As his wife, I could do nothing but watch and weep. Cestus looking defeated, wretched, Silas angry and defiant. Then there was the third man. He was so beaten, he looked half dead already. He couldn't even carry his own cross, he was so weak. Someone had placed a kind of crown of thorns on his head, and the blood was running down into his eyes. He was too weak to even try to wipe it away. I knew what these other two had done, had even helped my guilt and horror. But what could this man have done to be treated in such a way? I stood miserably by, horrified, but unable to look away when they began to crucify him. I knew Cestus was next. The executioner wore an apron with pockets. He placed 2 5-inch nails between his teeth and knelt down beside the right arm of this beaten man. Another soldier knelt with his knee on the forearm, holding it flat to the board. With his right hand, the executioner probed the wrist of the man to find the hollow spot, much as he would do with Cestus in mere minutes. Then, resting the nail against that spot, he brought the hammer down with force. I flinched, but my eyes remained riveted. The executioner jumped across the body to the other wrist. Finally, I wrenched my eyes away and sobbed as I heard the hammer strike the nail. I didn't want Cestus to die. I didn't want to lose him. When I looked back, they were raising the man by the nails of his wrists until his feet left the ground. His body writhed as they placed the crossbeam on the post. Silas again began to curse, this time at the man on the cross. The sign above his head said, Jesus, King of the Jews. I gasped, so this was the man who had claimed to be the Jews' new Messiah. Cestus and I had actually been looking for him before we met Silas, and he convinced Cestus that the road to reform was a bloody one. Suddenly I was filled with anger for this man who had almost misled me, given me a false hope. Someone yelled something about Jesus' claims to rebuild the temple in 3 days and his inability to save himself now. When the guard threw Cestus to the ground and the executioner began his work on him, I joined in the curses. Cestus too seemed to lose his former reserve, and with every pound of the nail he screamed, and every scream became a curse at this man, Jesus, who had blinded many with a false hope and now could do nothing to save himself, or us. Watching Cestus on the cross, I knew the true agony of crucifixion. His head tossed side to side in spasms under the unbearable heat of the sun. He sagged towards the bottom of the cross and panicked. I knew he was suffocating now, unable to breathe in that position. I wanted to stop watching, but I couldn't. As only a wife could, I felt rather than simply saw his suffering. In panic, he struggled to stand on the nail of his foot, pulling himself up by the nails of his wrists until he could breathe. When he couldn't stand the pain in his hands anymore, he sagged back down. When he couldn't breathe again, he would force himself back up. This anguish cycle continued over and over. Silas continued to yell curses at the man between us. I wondered where he found the energy or breath. I too was angry that this man could not save us from this unbearable agony. Then this man pulled himself up and took a deep breath enough to utter a prayer, but not a prayer for himself. No, he prayed for the forgiveness of those who had crucified him. Such a thing to do amidst such agony. Suddenly, I realized this man had done nothing wrong. What kind of man could truly ask for the forgiveness of those who had wronged him? Maybe he wasn't only a man. Cestus felt it too, for the next time Silas cursed this man Jesus, he drew himself up and uttered the first courageous words I'd heard since this whole thing began. Do you not fear even God, though you have been condemned to the same punishment? Silas had sunk down again, unable to hear, but my husband continued, fighting the pain to say what he had to say. Besides, we suffer justly and are getting what we deserve for our crimes. But this man has done no wrong. Jesus, remember me when you return in your glory. The Messiah raised himself, breathed painfully, and said words which brought peace to my husband and hope to me.
Truthfully, today you shall be with me in paradise.
To watch your son die while others mocked him, to see the nails driven into his hands, to see his friends desert him, to hear him cry out in pain, and just to want to hold him, to comfort him, to protect him. Others call him King, Messiah, and perhaps he was. But he was my son. He told me this would happen. He told me he had to die, that this was to be his glory everlasting, and somewhere, some part of me knew this to be true. But how can a mother watch her son die in agony, friendless, and understand such things as he said? This man, my son, the child I raised, Jesus, my son. John was a good man. He was there for Jesus, and he was there for me. Together, we watched him suffer and die. We heard him incredibly forgive his enemies and were somehow unsurprised. But all I could think of was my son suffering and me unable to help. Then Jesus nodded to John, and we both came forward. We approached until we stood directly below him. And when we saw the wounds, the wretched figure of my son, I bowed my head and sobbed. But as I was worrying for my son, even now, his thoughts were for me. Even on the cross, his concern for my welfare was greater than his own. For as I stood with my head bowed, I heard him speak.
Mother, behold your son.
At first, I thought he was referring to himself, but when I looked up, I saw that he was looking at John. Gratefully, I began to understand. Joseph had died. It was the responsibility of my firstborn, Jesus, to see that I was taken care of. But Jesus knew he would be unable to fulfill that responsibility. So while I had been wishing to comfort and protect him, he had already been thinking about how to care for me. I looked gratefully at John. Jesus' next words confirmed my thoughts. Looking at John, Jesus attempted a smile and painfully said,
Son, behold your mother.